Right, so Syria has fallen overnight. The so-called Syrian Rebels swept into Damascus and Bashar Al-Assad has fled. His presidency of 24 years is over. Assad family control over Syria going back 53 years has come to an end. And we have therefore witnessed the end of what has been an extensively awful regime for a very long time that has exerted brutal control over its people, and therefore scenes of celebration should not be a surprise. But they may also be short-lived, because you have to appreciate that we've been here before in recent history. We have to bear in mind the so-called Syrian rebels were nothing of the sort, but are themselves the terrorist remnant of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and that they have been extensively backed by the West, notably the US, but also by Turkey, and most crucially of all, by Israel. By allying themselves with the worst elements of Middle Eastern terrorism, Israel is now mobilizing once again and pushing into Syria already. So where people celebrate liberation today, they might find that is very short-lived, and what replaces Assad could well be even worse, as they become the new front in Israel's wider war. Right, so the fall of the Assad regime, well, nobody is going to cry much about that finally ending, are they? But how it has ended and what moves in to replace it now is almost certainly going to be just as bad, if not worse. Not that the mainstream media will project such thinking. Here, after all, is the front page of the Tory Graph today, for example, amongst other pages it's had of similar ilk, calling the rebels diversity friendly in this case. That's quite some rehabilitation for Al-Qaeda, isn't it? This is the same organisation that was behind 9/11, now being supported by the US. This is the same organisation that was behind the Manchester Arena bombing, especially pertinent to Syria, as that event was, given the bombers' motivation was Western-led intervention in the Syrian civil war. The Muslim deaths that came with that, a war which has now basically ended with Assad's defeat now, of course. The price the West pays sometimes for interfering in the affairs of other countries, because sometimes that doesn't come in the form of refugees in small boats. Sometimes the motivation ends up revisiting us as revenge instead, and yet we never seem to learn. Some might express surprise at how quickly all of this has actually happened. It was only yesterday that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the modern name for these Al-Qaeda leftovers, hit Homs, which is some 2 hours drive up the road from Damascus. But the two are connected via the M5 International Highway, good road links therefore. And in between, of course, there's hardly anything there. No, hardly any people, just empty, desolate landscape mainly. Every time people flee one city that's been hit by HTS, as they have made their way from Aleppo to Hama to Homs, and now finally on to Damascus, people and military have simply fled miles to the next city. So this has taken just 4 short jumps, really. This, of course, was just the main front the Syrian army was fighting, though. More fighters affiliated with HTS were attacking from the south as well, and from the east too. So the army, what was left of it after 13 years of civil war in Syria, was overstretched, certainly. Their commanders were quitting, not wanting to fight for Assad anymore, as the Syrian economy was tanking as well, and he himself had become a hugely unpopular dictator. And so whole units fell, and the air support Russia had offered, along with Revolutionary Guard Corps support, who are organised into small groups themselves, that had come from Iran, they were finite. It was limited support. It was insufficient to make any real difference, slowed things down for a day or two. But they had their own issues, of course, right now to deal with in part as well. And this is why, now that Syria fell to a bunch of Western and Israel-backed rebels, and yet stood their ground against the US previously, it's all taken a final toll not just on numbers but morale too. The people of Syria celebrate today. Many around the world celebrate the end of the Assad regime. Pretty much all that a lot of these people have ever known. And much of the media are putting out scenes of cheer and celebration. Frankly, who can blame them when they've lived under such oppression for so many years? The civil war there has seen 600,000 Syrians killed, 2/3 of that number being innocent civilians. And when you're calling out Israel for doing basically exactly the same thing in Palestine, you can't have a double standard on this. The Assad regime was bloody awful. You would imagine it would be hard-pressed to imagine what comes next could possibly be even worse than that. But unfortunately, what comes next could well be even worse when the cheering and the celebrating subsides and reality actually dawns. But more on that in a moment. Firstly, we've now got another completely destabilised Middle Eastern nation on our hands, and we've been here before. Although Iraq has largely sorted itself out now to become a functional democratic nation, sovereign state in its own right, following the fall of Saddam Hussein, we saw the environment created immediately after that allowed for Al-Qaeda to build up its numbers, leading to an armed uprising, civil war, which Syria is only now seeing the end of one, and further down the line, the rise of Islamic State came along, ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, whatever you want to call them. They literally came into being, aided in part not just by instability in Iraq, but also that same Syrian civil war, which by this point had begun. In Syria, perhaps there is hope things will go slightly differently, but that may only be the case because HTS is simply the latest iteration of those same Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces. So the new administration and a smooth transition of power is being promised by the currently still serving Syrian Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali, but as for Assad himself, he appears to have fled. Though communications with his plane had apparently been lost, there's a story that's been going around it may have been shot down. We don't know for sure. We'll find out in due course, I dare say. But much as we saw in Iraq following the fall of Saddam Hussein, there was jubilation and cheering and statues getting pulled down, and the same has now been seen in Syria. But I caution against too much cheering, because what we've got now is a new administration in the offing, an Al-Qaeda/ISIS-led government, for that is what they are. News outlets and the world can call them HTS now, but this is who they are. Can they form a government? If so, what sort of a government is that even going to be? I'm thinking obviously they're going to try, but what's it going to look like? As much as the Assad regime was responsible for the killing of Syrian civilians, so were those they were fighting, the likes of HTS or Al-Qaeda and ISIS as they were in years before. Why should they be any better now? What gives people that impression? On what basis is that based? From the perspective of the Syrian people after 53 years of Assad rule, any change is likely to be a promising one for them. But a government formed by designated terrorists? ISIS are a terrorist organisation, as are Al-Qaeda, as are HTS. And yet they've been backed by the US, who themselves designate HTS as a terrorist group. Though via their proxies in Israel, mostly as that happened, have they aided them, because destabilising Syria, as I spoke about in a video on this yesterday, cuts Iran off from their allies in Hezbollah in Lebanon. The US, incidentally, have also been caught directly aiding HTS too, not just hiding behind Israel, as it's also been reported that US A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft have been filmed attacking Syrian forces and aiding these so-called rebels, who are really terrorists. That'd be the US aiding remnants of the same organisation that took down the Twin Towers then. How 20 years makes a difference, eh? But interestingly, Israel are, whilst taking advantage of this, also seeking to now distance themselves from it, which all adds to my suspicions that their Greater Israel objective is what really matters here to them. Allies of HTS when it was convenient to them, but now they've won, so to speak, well, now they're the next in line to fall. In light of HTS's victory, Israel have already moved into the Golan Heights. They already occupy. It's occupied Syrian territory, as that is, that Israel have held since 1967. And their reasoning for that, they claim, is to create a buffer zone against the new Syrian regime. I'm going there from the start. These are the terrorists. It's a regime. Israel have literally already invaded Syria, having passed through the Golan Heights. That's their territory in their minds anyway. Donald Trump said so as well, the orange idiot. But they've already moved into the still Syrian sovereign territory of Quneitra. This is within a buffer zone that has existed between Israeli-occupied Golan and Syria since 1974. However, it is also being reported that Israeli forces haven't stopped there either and have moved on to Khan Arnabay, which is beyond the buffer zone, and if true, then Israel has already begun an invasion of Syria itself. This, of course, would all be in keeping with that plan for Greater Israel, that map shown here with much of Syria forming part of that. So is Israel's support for toppling the Assad regime all part of their plans for taking over Syria themselves in the long term? And not just destabilising land connections to Lebanon by Iran, but occupying it themselves too? Well, I dare say we're going to find out very shortly, because where Syrians are celebrating today, tomorrow they could find their country at war once again, and yet again it comes back to the genocidal apartheid state of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu absolutely wants a wider war. He needs it to stay in power. And moving into Syria brings him one step closer to Iran, and hopefully in his mind, his long wished for goal of dragging the US into a war against Iran formally. Get all the details of those moves in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. More background into how this Syria situation suits him, no end. Please do support the channel whilst you are here as well by hitting like, share and subscribe. It's very much appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.